it was weird too. And especially if you think about it, like we started a company, and that company, I mean, it's not a lot of money into even back then, but it, it's generating like.
On this episode of Ken's Nearest Neighbors, I had the pleasure of interviewing Josh Odmark. Josh is the founder and CTO of Pandia. He started his very first company at the age of 15 and sold it by the time he was 18. He's been a serial entrepreneur ever since. He's passionate about bringing artificial intelligence to the masses and dreams of one day having a world where AI has a positive impact on the entire planet. He's currently instrumental in building our data-driven future at Pandio.com. In this interview, we talked about how the data collected from Josh's early company fed his fascination with engineering and data science. We also talk about Skynet and the future of technology. I hope you enjoy. Josh, thank you so much for coming on. Obviously, you're running things over at Pandio, and you have some really cool, I guess, entrepreneurial experience from a pretty young age that led into a huge interest in data science and the data analytics space. So I'm really excited to have you on to talk about those types of things today.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I appreciate you taking the time to chat today. Yeah, for me, from a young age, really in high school is kind of when I sort of had that entrepreneurial spirit. It was sort of set in stone because I started a company when I was a freshman in college with somebody I had never met before. This is like early 2000s, and it was pretty rare to start a company with somebody over the internet. Even the internet at that time was in its infancy, so it's kind of an odd thing to do, but that company took off and just went gangbusters. It was all centered around running very popular websites, and so that's what really got the bug of sort of the power of data all the way back then. Because those sites became very popular, one, for example, was like a forum. So it had a bunch of people posting comments and topics and threads and things like that. Another one was downloading sort of programmatic scripts for like Python and PHP. So I was definitely it's like hot scripts, although I'm not even sure hot scripts is still around, but it was just little code snippets you could download for free just to help you, build things. But those were like insanely popular, like over 500,000 visits a month. And so that generated just ridiculous amounts of data. And this was before there was really any packaged analytics. So I was just sort of sitting there running SQL, like figuring things out, like doing counts and understanding that there was a large amount of visitors in a certain state and just trying to figure out why that was, where did they come from, how'd they find us and things like that. So really just sort of stuck early, and I sold that as a freshman in college, and that's sort of what made me think being an entrepreneur was easy. Of course, little did I know that first success. I've had plenty of failures since, but yeah, I mean, it was pretty gnarly just to have that go gangbusters in high school and then sort of sell it as a freshman. Yeah, it was pretty gnarly. It was a fun ride.
That's incredible. I mean, obviously, it's so normal now. I mean, I've done quite a lot of content with people that I've never met in person. I've started a couple really small businesses that with people that I've never met in person. And I guess looking back at that age, that's completely unheard of. And I think it's kind of fun to be, a little bit of a pioneer in that space. How did you guys, one, get connected, and two, like, how did you manage a workflow between two people?
Yeah, so it was difficult. I mean, so I met Leaf was his name. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. He passed away, but
I'm sorry to hear that.
he was sort of yeah. He was sort of a young guy like myself, just a couple years older. So he was just out of college while I was still in high school. So he owned one of those websites that was very popular that I just happened to be a sort of member of, and he asked for people to sort of help him build some things. And so that's how I just started to get to know him. It was still another year after that before we did any sort of partnership together. So it was just a very natural sort of progression. For me, he was just an email and a username. And I slowly got to know him over time, and we worked really well together. And then I brought him an idea he had two popular sites at the time, and I brought him an idea where he could sort of turn that into 3, 4, 5, 10 popular websites to sort of like use the two to build traffic to another. And we tested it. He liked the idea, and it just went crazy. So, over the next 2 years, we became good buddies. But it was definitely weird because you don't. It's like there was ICQ back in the day, so you really interact with like text chat, and there's no tone. It's really hard to sort of properly know somebody over ICQ. But then we eventually got to sort of phone calls and things like that. And but it was weird too, and especially if you think about it, like we started a company, and that company, it's not a lot of money into even back then, but it was generating like $30,000 in revenue a month, which for a
For a
senior in
college
high
kid, pretty
school,
pretty darn good.
yeah, exactly. So it was more money than I could even spend at the time, but so think about that. Like, I set up an LLC and things like that, and he extended the trust to me. So I sort of ran the bank account and the LLC, and then it just worked. If that trust couldn't have been extended, I don't even know how that would have happened. But yeah, and then it just went amazing after that.
Well, one thing I really like about that is how you got involved. It seemed like you were engaged in a community, right? You built something, you built the trust, you were part of that community. And because of that, you were kind of let in a little bit further into expanding the community more. And that's something
Hmm.
that I'm encouraging with people involved in data science who want to learn, like be part of these communities. You never know what positive impact that could have. It could be like, hey, they forward you on to someone in their network for a position that opens up. You meet someone through the community, not even the head of the community that you start a business with or you start a project with. Um, like people coming together in these places where there's a common form of interest is a very, very powerful thing. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I started that 66 days of data challenge, is that, hey, there's a place where you can go and meet people that are like-minded, and like incredible things can come out of those places.
Yeah, I think even too for people like it's one thing to say that, and you're so right, but it's like people don't understand the short gap between you can sort of show up at some of these meetup groups and things like that, and it can lead to like a full-time gig or something in like a crazy short amount of time. Data science is one of those things right now where the community is growing in every way possible. So just getting involved. I've seen like VPs of head of data science for Fortune 500 companies at these sort of meetups. And it even grows out of the university too. A lot of the sort of PhDs teaching these things, they may not be directly in the corporate world, but they've got a foot in it. So they can do a lot of introductions and sort of steer you from a career perspective. But it's been one of the most amazing things from my perspective too, is being sort of put into those communities and talking to the people there and just realizing who you're sort of rubbing shoulders with. It's pretty amazing.
So while we're on the topic of, I guess, like meeting people in data science, when was the first time you actually worked with or met or collaborated with a data scientist with which had like the typical data science skill set and story associated with them?
Yeah, so I would say it was about 5 years ago, and before that, I sort of rubbed elbows with people that were clearly very skilled from an engineering perspective and analytical perspective. So they were doing things that were definitely along the lines of data-driven decisions and things like that. But it wasn't until about 5 years ago when I really spoke with someone that in the hardcore ML and AI space, where they could sort of draw the line or the distinction between sort of data-driven decisions that are more analytical in nature versus like hardcore machine learning, like linear regression all the way into neural networks. And so his name specifically was Adam Tashman. He's a PhD, teaches at UC Santa Barbara. So we hired him at a startup, and that was just absolutely amazing because I worked hand in hand with him building machine learning and AI. My role was definitely on the engineering side. It was kind of like making it all work. So taking the prototypes and the MVPs that he would create, and making it something that could drive value for the business or that we could sell to customers. So I had to sort of figure out the puzzle. And when I first started, I didn't, it was like a black box in the sense of like I had no idea what it sort of did. It's kind of like you feed in a bunch of data and you get a floating point out of it. And it's like, and people pay a lot of money for that floating point prediction, you know. But for me, it was like I honestly have no idea what the hell it's doing, you know. But he sort of walked me through and explained the features and why it does certain things and why algorithms are better at certain problems, and he dove into the math, and it's kind of funny because it looked very much like I was back in college. You know, he's up on the whiteboard like drawing things, and he's like, okay, now it's really important for you to understand this piece because it feeds into the next piece. He's like, so, you know, let me know if you have any questions. This is kind of how it works. And it was like whiteboarding sessions over weeks and months. And then I finally sort of understood. Of course, I'm nowhere near a PhD data scientist, but I knew enough to, if I'm going to sort of build these things for my company, or I know how they work and I know why they work a certain way. So and the things that are important and things to look out for, et cetera, et cetera. So that was like a crash course that just, you know, I probably learned in a month things that take 5 years to learn. So it was absolutely incredible just to be paired with somebody of that caliber.
That's awesome. And, you know, I think it's interesting that you bring up, you know, like his PhD background, how he's very advanced in the field. I think that it doesn't take a PhD to be able to apply these things, right? For the
Yeah.
most part, if he's building out a unique infrastructure, solving very specified problems for your company, that might require that extra level. If it's essentially uncharted territory, work on problems that have not been solved before. But most companies, they're working through problems that have been solved before. There's use cases, and you know, I am a firm believer that most data scientists can handle the questions or the problems that are that there is some precedence for.
Yep. And I see that too. You know, the position I'm in, I'm very fortunate to talk to a lot of very big companies, and I see most of the time they don't even have a PhD on staff. Like it's a lot of data engineers, people that have done it before. They've worked with maybe PhDs in the past. But one of the beauties of the data science community is, and this didn't used to be the case, there wasn't a lot of sort of content to really chew on. So a lot of what you would find is sort of like the published papers and things like that. And for, you know, someone that's not classically trained, that's like a foreign language, what's in those
Yes.
papers. So then you come out with like this, you know, the libraries that Python has and things like that, and that helped tremendously. But that's still very technical in nature. But now these days you have like the blog towards data science and a lot of other things where someone is starting from the beginning to explain, or the code samples out there start from the beginning. They don't assume certain things and sort of toss you in right at the sort of feature extraction and vectorization and things like that. It sort of talks about the things before that. So I think that's why a lot of people, you don't necessarily need to be classically trained. And in many ways, I would argue for a lot of use cases, you would be better off to be classically trained as a programmer than a data scientist in today's world, because you got things where off the shelf libraries, you can sort of feed those things in. You've got SageMaker from AWS. You've got things that sort of help you along, and you always have to understand the theories and things because you want to understand what is being outputted from your model. But in the real world, we see a lot of times these companies that are AI startups and things like that, or the AI things inside of large companies, are not driven by the PhDs. So I find that very fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, something I want to echo what you said is that the programming skill set, there's a bit of a premium on that. And I completely agree. I think that if I was starting to learn data science, I would want to understand the programming first, because that lets me implement all these things. It lets me get my hands dirty. It lets me experiment and try things out. If we're focusing on the statistics and the math to start with, which I think you should absolutely have a solid grasp of the theory, you can't iterate as quickly. I can't like plug stuff into a model and see it spit stuff out. You know, I'm doing just what you're saying. I'm doing like vector multiplication, right? And so, or linear
Hmm.
algebra, whatever that is. And so, to me, I went back and did a full-blown master's in computer science rather than data science, because that's the skill set that I thought would pay the most dividends going forward.
Yeah, that's amazing to hear. And I see, for us, we look at, when I say us, I mean my company Pandia, but even me as in an individual, if I look at like why initiatives have failed and the initiatives that I've had to personally build in the past, one of the things that's very hard is you've got sort of your data science team that can build that sort of MVP, but to sort of productize or productionize something like that is almost as hard as the data science itself. And what a lot of companies do is they take that MVP from the data science team, they sort of throw it over the fence to the engineers and the DevOps, and that's where a lot of things go wrong, because it's not fully understood where some simple things like casting a floating point as an integer, that's basically in data science turning something with a very precise number into a Boolean. Like that can be
It'd be
catastrophic to a
disastrous, yeah.
model. So there's these things that aren't well understood for a traditional software engineer. So there's that gap between, traditional software engineering and machine learning, and it is very big right now. So when you come in as a data engineer or a data scientist, and you don't have to be an expert, but if you're an intermediate with Python, skill wise, you can provide immense value in closing that gap. I've personally had to train people to be that bridge. And it's basically the combination of a DevOps person moving into ML ops. Those are the people I sort of had to train to make sure that that bridge happens successfully. And even now, like, so Adam, who I worked with and mentioned previously, he's the PhD. So he didn't really know much Python at all. He was sort of, mostly R. And so now he moves so much into Python, and I helped him sort of improve his skill set so much with Python, and then hiring people that were experts to help him as well. He now teaches Spark at the university. So with Python. So, it's an immense skill. And one of the reasons why I see in the real world, data scientists spend like 90% of their time not doing machine learning. They're doing all the other stuff, the data prep, the cleaning, all that, and before they can actually get to the heavy lifting. Some of that's just the labor's not there in the market, so just a necessary evil. But yeah, it's that skill set is incredibly valuable these days.
Yeah, well,
right now, not even in the future, like right now.
Well, especially at larger companies. I mean, you're seeing essentially ML engineers coming out and trying to fill that gap, but it's still, there's that vagueness around all the data science positions where some data scientists by title are doing like MLE work, while some are doing data analyst work. And so I think that that's always a tougher the interviewing process for companies and also for data scientists, that you really don't know what you're going to get even from the job application or the categorization that they put on the title.
Yeah, and I'm still surprised. I mean, we work with a lot of data scientist interns because we want to sort of give back to the community, and they come out of the university with hardly any programming experience, especially in Python. Like they may be decent in R, but even then, like if I were to sort of grade their skills, it's at best an intermediate level of skill set in raw programming. And I mean, that's what they do at the end of the day. So, for me, like definitely those programs need to be adjusted, because someone that has so little experience, you inevitably spend time fixing that problem, teaching them and pair programming, putting them with an engineer and things like that, just to up that sort of base level of programming skill set. So somebody that comes in with that is like a fresh, breath of fresh air, just helps a lot across the board.
Yeah. Well, something, an interesting analogy I just thought of is, programming languages is how we communicate, right? Would you rather have a conversation with someone who's an incredible conversationalist, but has like kind of average knowledge of a subject area, or have a conversation with someone who's just not a good communicator, but who has a lot of knowledge of a subject area, right? If you're talking
Yeah.
about pure usefulness, the person that's a good conversationalist, you're going to get a lot more out of that conversation because they can flow with it. They're not going to like cut you off rudely or do some of these things. And, you know, it's so important to communicate, and like the programming language you use and like coding is how data scientists communicate anything or put things into the world. And there's a real imperative on that skill.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. That's a really good highlight too, and especially bridges the gap into, companies that are trying to do data science now. And, it's not just the technical challenge. You've got cultural challenges and the sort of who's in charge of things, driving initiatives at companies and things like that. So all those things become sort of very important. And if it's kind of like a lot of companies are doing their first initiative, so you really do have to sort of look at it in a similar way you just described. If you're trying to achieve just a simple initiative so that you can get another one approved and another one, and really move your company to be data driven. But yeah, these are very difficult challenges people are going through right now.
Awesome. And so I want to touch, we'll get really deep into what you guys do at Pandio and the problems that you're seeking to solve there, or that you've identified that you guys can help with. But before that, I want to get a little bit deeper into how you first got involved in the engineering side. How you started coding and programming for the first time. I think that's relevant based on the other things we've talked about.
Yeah, for sure. So that first company that I mentioned, I was kind of your traditional graphic designer. I was kind of that guy that was inside of Photoshop, creating graphics and things like that, for friends and family for the most part. And then when that company went gangbusters, it was sort of on autopilot. So it's kind of like, we're just making money hand over fist, not much to do. Looking at the balance sheet, it's like, we've got these few expenses. How can we get rid of them? Some of it was just boredom. It's kind of like, how can I contribute? And we had a programmer that was full time. And so I just sort of learned programming just for the simple reason of offsetting that cost. I had no training in it. I come from a sort of arty type family, I guess, more artistic. And but when I sort of learned programming, it just stuck with me. It was like, I'm a natural problem solver and always sort of lean towards math and science. So it was just amazing to me that you can sort of spend time writing code, and then it was in the end something so much more powerful than yourself. It was I remember the first time I understood what a sort of for loop allowed you to actually create, from even just simple mathematics to also iterating and generating web pages and things like that. So it's like, I remember my mind sort of like, oh my goodness, like these languages are so powerful. And that's what sort of planted the seed. And I, of course, I think one of the reasons why I sort of went down that path is I was also very good at it. So it's always a good combination when you really like it and you're really good at it. So since that day, I've really just dropped anything to do with graphic design and just been sort of your core engineer. And because I was always involved in startups and things like that, I got a really good sort of breadth of knowledge when it comes to developing an MVP, and then also scaling it, sort of the hockey stick growth that companies go through. And that kind of became what I was known for, is just helping companies get the MVP and scaling it to sort of the next phase of their company. And that's what I've been doing for well over a decade now. So that's kind of where the bug was, and that was in high school. And in the early 2000s, I mean, PHP was in its infancy back then. I can't even remember the version back then, but yeah, that was in the days of like coding and Dreamweaver and stuff like that, which is, people probably don't even know Dreamweaver anymore.
Adobe product.
Yeah. They had a nice suite of products back then, so Photoshop was pretty killer too. So
yeah, well, I use all Adobe stuff for the video creation, so
nice.
I'm familiar. But no, I love that. Something that is fascinating to me about that story for you is that it seemed like programming, that skill set was a means to an end. You had a very clear end goal, is either to save cost, or it was to be able to build something really cool, or you had this power that you harnessed. It wasn't necessarily like, oh, I'm going to learn this because I'm fascinated with the individual parts, right? The for loop
Hmm.
allows you to do bigger and greater things. And once you realize that power, that's an incredibly cool feeling. It's incredibly motivating. You're like, wow, the world is in my hands once I understand this, because I can build almost anything that I want.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's very eloquently put. I mean, that's exactly what I was sort of after. It was always the end game, and there's times when you're like you're inside the actual language, you're building a class or function or a method, and you're kind of like this is not super fun, but it's like necessary, you know. But then you see the end thing and all the things people can do, and it's really just amazing. So I love chasing that feeling of putting an MVP in a customer's hands and sort of seeing them light up and be like, yeah, you know, like it's exactly why you did it, is to make their life easier or allow them to see something differently. So it's an amazing feeling.
Awesome. Well, let's talk a little bit more about some of the other businesses that you started and how that led you to Pandio. If I recall, you were working pretty heavily in, I think it was the health insurance space, and you learned some pretty interesting lessons about how big organizations are managing data. What was that experience like?
Yeah, so when I was in Santa Barbara, I connected up with a company called Carpe Data, and they're just in the general insurance space. So they just help insurance companies use more of their data and more types of data for the purposes of risk assessment and things like that. So that was a really fascinating thing because we got really in depth with companies like Allstate and State Farm and things like that, and to see they have just an absolute ton of data, even data that you wouldn't expect them to sort of have. You know, like some of them had like all satellite imagery of the entire United States, like at a resolution higher than what you can just go get off the internet. You know, some of that's like because they specifically hired an airplane to take photos or whatever, but they have just tremendous amounts of data, and it's no secret that they have a lot of money as well. So they were doing some really interesting things where they were sort of working with us to say, is this possible? Could, with a machine learning algorithm, could you do X? And so we would do a lot of sort of pilots around that. But that was really fascinating because we got to work with their teams on their side and see how they sort of run things, and engineer around some very difficult problems of dealing with machine learning at such a massive scale. I mean, you could just imagine trying to write something or use a system to process hundreds of petabytes of images. There's so many difficulties in doing that. Beyond just ETL or physically moving the data and things like that. So that was a really exciting time. And like I sort of described a crash course with Adam, he was with me at that particular company. Um, Being embedded inside of those companies and seeing what they do and sort of putting our brains together with those companies to build these amazing things was just a lot of fun. So that was an incredible company, and they had great success, sort of helping insurance companies leverage new data, and they still do it today. But that was almost 3 years of just constant machine learning with those huge insurance companies, and it was just tons of fun to sort of not just do the sort of MVP or the prototype or prove that it can be done. Just like once you prove that, then they're like, okay, like we want this in production now. So now you've got to sort of like, and we're talking these big insurance companies. So you can't just stand up like a little microservice that they can hit like 10 times a day, you know? It's like, this is a huge insurance company that's going to run this service over. Like it's got to be enterprise grade.
Very
And it
robust.
was my job to connect all those pieces, not to do the hardcore machine learning. That was on the data science team, but I had to sort of quarterback everything. So that was just incredible to see, and it was incredible also to see the end product actually work. And they gave us feedback over the years of like how much value it was very precisely driving, and that was incredibly rewarding. Those companies, some you may think of them as sort of dinosaurs or not on the cutting edge, but you'd be shocked. I mean, they're investing heavily, and they've got a lot of very smart people, and they're willing to sort of do a lot of different things. Sometimes the insurance industry sort of gets a bad rap just because of the regulatory stuff on it. And that does sort of complicate things. You can't sort of develop a model on Friday and put it into production on Monday. It's got to go through regulatory approval, but they're pretty good with all those processes and things like that. So they really are doing pretty incredible things that I think would shock a lot of people. They just don't really talk about it. And until you work with them or get embedded with them, you never really know about it.
Awesome. And so, you talked a lot about the cool stuff associated with that, but what were some of the challenges that you ran into that maybe started the gears turning for building at Pandia?
So when I was doing that, it sort of became very obvious. I was always reinventing the wheel. So there's always that sort of what I described earlier. We have like the sort of traditional engineering and DevOps, and then there's a bridge or a gap that you're trying to fill there with the bridge, and then the data science and ML ops. And so for me, bridging that gap always involved labor as well as developing software to sort of plug into both sides to sort of make it all work. And in many cases, when machine learning gets really advanced and you have like a positive feedback loop or reinforced learning or something, then it ends up, instead of being a linear pipeline, it becomes sort of circular. And so it starts feeding itself. So literally developing those systems, like writing the code, the Python code, or the Kubernetes and cloud native type infrastructure, it became like painfully obvious. I was constantly recreating these things, and there was nothing sort of out there that was really good. So that's why we sort of started Pandio, that was a big hurdle for AI and ML initiatives. It's like that was something that every company had to sort of trudge through the mud and just get through it. And it's not an easy piece to do. So sometimes initiatives failed because of that, not because of the model didn't have accuracy or anything like that. So that can be very frustrating to see an initiative fail because of the logistics and not the actual machine learning. So that's kind of what Pandu does at the end of the day, is they really solve that middleware logistical piece. We give you the ability to sort of create a virtual data lake. So to connect all your databases and query them with SQL as if they were one database, as well as a sort of enterprise service bus that can help with the ingestion of data and movement of data. So if you can imagine, you want to move petabytes of data into your model or into your training script, and then once you have your model, you need a way of like sending requests to the model, and then the output of the model you want to send to a different place so that somebody can analyze it. The actual pipes to do that is what Pandio does as well. So we really wanted to solve all that logistical middleware problems that companies have with an all-in-one SaaS solution. So you can just sort of, sign up for Pandio, and you have ability to connect to all your databases and all your applications in terms that you're familiar with, both a traditional engineer as well as a data scientist.
That's awesome. I cannot stress how big a problem that has been in companies I've worked in the past. Essentially, I worked at a company as a Fortune 100 company, and they had data in 60 different databases across the organization, and they were not very well designed to be able to join them together, to be able to work with the data across the different platforms. There's also a bunch of data intake systems that aren't putting the data into a structured data format. That is a real challenge that I think almost every organization that's growing quickly sees.
Yeah.
Especially, I would imagine you saw that in your startup work as well, is that, rather than integrating a new data endpoint into an existing database, sometimes it's easier to just create a new database for this. And that creates a little bit of a bigger problem when you have databases scaling out rather than just one getting bigger.
Yeah. You describing that's probably giving some viewers PTSD, but it's very hard. And we work with companies that are, massive, that have acquired 10 other companies. So it wasn't even I wouldn't say bad decision, but it's like it wasn't even a decision. It's like they acquired a company. They obviously have completely different systems and databases and things like that. And over time, you acquire more and more and more. You need to sort of connect them together. And so that's kind of what we're specialists at. And it takes it like a step further, because there's virtual data lake or data abstraction software out there, and it's pretty amazing. But you always find that those tools, rarely get you past 80% of the way. There's a like that we just dealt with this Thursday of last week. So there's a customer that had an address field in their database. So it was all one string, and then their other database had it broken out by city, street, house number, et cetera, et cetera. And they wanted to do a join against that. And they're trying to do things like, put a light query in SQL. And it was, I mean, that right there is going to, create an order of magnitude slower query. And they're trying to do it over massive volume, and it's going to create inaccurate results. So we help them sort of use our system to write that sort of query. But because of Pandio's unique offering, you can send that address field through a machine learning algorithm, something like libpostal, that splits out city, state, zip, and things into unique fields. And then you can do a join straight up city to city, how you would normally want to do that, which just improved the speed dramatically and allowed them to sort of be much more accurate. So, I mean, that's just a very simple example of where sometimes when you do things like query in place, which is amazing in and of itself, to just be able to do a join across two completely different databases, that idea is amazing in and of itself. But sometimes you need a bit more. You need to massage the data a bit. And that's that sort of additional functionality that we built, because we saw it constantly. They might use abstraction, but only get some 80% of the way there at best, and they want to get that other 20%. So that functionality sort of allows that.
Awesome. And so, kind of, I guess, to that point, you're talking about specific use cases. Are you guys more of a software as a service, or do you guys use a lot of, I guess, do a lot of bespoke work for individual clients?
So we're just a SaaS offering right now. What we've found is that a lot of companies are hurting for this sort of help. It's very hard to hire people in this sort of space. So we do some bespoke stuff, mainly just for large enterprises, to help them accelerate their integration. They, instead of taking 6 months, they can sort of get it to market in 2. So we do a little bit of that, but for the most part, we're just your traditional SaaS. You can sort of sign up and use it in AWS, Google, or Azure. Or if you want it installed on-prem, we have enterprise offerings to do that as well. But at its core, it's just a sort of SaaS offering where you can go into a UI and connect things up, add connectors to connect to MySQL, Postgres, Redshift, Snowflake, and things like that. Or programmatically, from your SQL client, doing that as well. So that's typically the popular ways people, interact with our offering.
Awesome. And then, so I guess one of my uh, like last questions about Pandio in general is, how are you guys personally leveraging machine learning in your own infrastructure and your own systems? I think that that's something where you're enabling it, but how are you using it as well?
Yeah, so this is always very fascinating to us, of course. I mean, it's what we do. So, but maybe your audience will find it interesting as well. So we always thought it was very interesting to sort of dog food our own sort of pitch on things. So, we talk about enabling AI and ML and, connecting to cutting edge technology. The other thing that we sort of saw when I was building these systems is it's very hard to manage them at scale, and not necessarily like huge company scale, but even like, decent type of scale. So what that ends up looking like is you end up having very specialized talent behind the scenes that are sort of turning knobs to keep a solution like what I'm describing up. And so we built a neural network that has a sort of reinforced learning component attached to it, that serves the sole purpose of offsetting the human labor side of running such a big system. So, we view ourselves as sort of a data fabric. So you can imagine implementing something like this at a major company. It's going to see some pretty absurd volumes. And maybe if you're running like click data or impression data through something like this, you could imagine, the sheer number of events or clicks or impressions that would have to flow through a system. So for a lot of these companies, that can be a team as small as one person. It can be upwards of 300 people, and their entire purpose is to sort of keep the system running. It can't go down. So we engineered a neural network that does that better than a human can do it. So it knows, instead of being reactionary when you need to scale something up, like say, for example, you're going to launch an ad campaign. And so you know that this particular system has, maybe 10 virtual machines or 10 computers powering it. You know that you're going to get a lot more traffic, so you need to double that or triple that. That would be normally a person going in and doing that at a specific time, but our system sort of predicts that. It sort of looks at your traffic patterns and knows that, at 2 p.m. every day, we get a lot of traffic, and so it needs to scale up automatically. It also sort of recognizes issues and addresses them. So it's pretty magical behind the scenes, but at the end of the day, it just sort of allows us to offer our service cheaper than the next guy. But it's pretty cool how we actually do that. I hope at some point this year, maybe next year, to write up all of how we're doing that, because I think it's a model that can be applied to other things like databases and microservices and a lot of other areas. So
That's incredible. I love that. And so I guess, that's pretty cutting edge from what I've seen. What's the future at Pandia? What do you think that looks like? Where would you like, the business or the company to go?
yeah, so I always raise eyebrows with my sort of pitch. It's funny because if you ask sort of our CEO, he's sort of your traditional talented MBA, so he has a bit more grounded sort of opinion of wanting to power every enterprise in the world. But for me, I always thought of like, if I were to think out in the future, like if you imagine something like Skynet or the singularity, if something like that was to be created, what would need to be created before that, And I always envisioned that sort of being some super intelligent AI was never going to be like one model that was that. It was always going to be some combination of a huge amount of neural networks. So it might be 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, a million neural networks with subnets and things like that. And if you assume that, then it's like something like that would likely have those neural networks connected to each other, where the output of one is the input of another. And you can imagine some huge mesh network of these AI models. So I sort of envisioned what would that literally look like. And so I always sort of approached it as like, I view Pandio as the thing that sort of is the pipes between those sort of models. So it would be the output, the floating point coming out of one neural network goes through Pandio into another, and it sort of orchestrates and coordinates that whole thing so that the sort of living organism or the main Skynet AI or whatever it is, Pandio is sort of the central nervous system of it. So that's like my pie in the sky. And you'd be surprised, there's a lot of companies, not many sort of have that vision of or in production today of hundreds of models or thousands of models that are all sort of dependent on each other, and it looks like a sort of bubble of mesh with things all interconnected in a sort of 3D geospatial way. But they're moving in that direction, and they're starting to understand that Kafka sort of started you to understand that you can sort of communicate across thousands of entities in a sort of real-time manner. And so, but it's sort of capped, and it was only meant to do those things analytically. So then, with Pandio, I envision like, what does that look like? What's that next step? So it's probably tens of thousands of models and, trillions of messages every day or every second or what have you. But that's sort of I would love to help companies, maybe not Skynet or the singularity of things like that, but if you look at some of the artificial intelligence that companies like Tesla and things like that are creating, we want to sort of help other companies get to that faster by them not having to create that sort of pipes between that or the logistical layer of something like that. So that would be my dream, is to help something along those lines. I view a lot of the things people are doing now as like scratching the surface. So in many ways, like when we talk to a lot of companies, it's like, we're sort of offering them a Ferrari when, a horse and buggy would service them well today, and it's sort of like, well, you're going to need the Ferrari, the Model T's coming down the Model A's coming down the pipeline. But yeah, that's my sort of, from a technologist, what would make me incredibly happy is to see 10,000 neural networks communicating in real time, generating some general artificial intelligence that's greater than the sum.
That's awesome. Well, hopefully they don't send a Terminator back to stop us from having this conversation.
Yeah, that would be dangerous. But yeah, it's pretty. Even thinking about it is just a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, that's it for the questions that I generally have. I only have one last thing, and that's to leave the floor open to you to talk about really anything you'd like. If it's advice for people, if it's an additional thoughts on Skynet or whatever that might be, the floor is yours for a couple of minutes here.
Yeah, so I think I would give two pieces of advice. The one we sort of touched on earlier is anytime you spend bolstering up your sort of code expertise is going to pay off in dividends. It's a big problem right now. So, and if you're just wanting to learn Python, there's a ridiculous amount of sources out there. You don't need to go to school for it. Find find the way that works for you to learn, whether it's videos, things of that nature. Or for me, it was always like downloading a code sample, so something that works, and then modifying it and seeing what it does. Whatever that is, there's a plethora of resources out there, and you don't necessarily have to pick one horse and sort of go with it. If you're relatively strong in R, then maybe experiment a little bit in Python, and know that at the end of the day, those languages aren't so important. It's more the concept of what's happening. So the general concept of how things work. You might change industries and get into like connected cars or something like that. But for them, it's very much about C and C++ and embedded systems and things like that. Don't let things like that sort of scare you. Once you sort of really extend your base or your understanding of some of these languages, you'll understand that you can sort of move between them a lot easier. I don't know that there's parallels with actual languages, but I can tell you, like, I knew Ruby and PHP very well and had never even seen Python, and I was able to pick it up in like a month or two. And now, being an expert in it sort of a year or two later. So once you have a strong foundation of just some language, the others are sort of easier to pick up. So don't let that sort of scare you and feel like you have to, spend 2 years on each language to be an expert in it. That's rarely the case, and you don't have to do that beforehand. So if you want to get into connected cars, but you're only strong in R, don't let that sort of, prevent you from doing that. And then I would say the second thing is to just get out there and connect with the industry in any way. There's a lot of opportunities because the labor force is so small. There's a huge amount of demand across the board. So, go to those sort of, now we're sort of in the pandemic, so you can't physically, but there's a lot of
Virtually.
Zoom meetups and things. Yeah, virtually. So just sort of reach out there and get connected with like-minded people that are doing this, and feel free to branch out too. It's not just about academics. There's groups about data engineering, so it's okay to sort of pop in there. Just find those communities because they may not be well advertised, but they're everywhere, and it won't take you very long to sort of find one. And you may not sort of, the first one you join may not be perfectly relevant to you, but just keep searching because there's a lot of them, and they're clamoring for sort of members to grow their community. So it's a hot area and not very hard to sort of get involved with things. And you never know, like some of those groups, they may spin off some prototype of something that turns into the next big open source sort of framework that everybody's sort of using. You really have no idea where some of these can lead, but the fact remains that there's a huge amount of opportunity. So it's good to just dive in.
Awesome stuff. That's incredible advice. I actually touch on the value of just learning your first programming language and how it makes it so much easier to learn the second and then the third and then the fourth in the last interview I did last week. So for anyone listening, definitely check that out after we finish this one here.
Yeah. People, it's daunting. I'm sure you can remember the first time you it's like the first language that most people are sort of introduced to is like Java, and that's sort of very hard one compared to sort of something that's on the web like PHP or Ruby or even Python, something that bridges the gap to something that's sort of interpreted in real time versus compiled. It's almost like it'd be better to sort of introduce people, even JavaScript. Like I've found like kids pick up on JavaScript a bit better than something else, and sort of it plants the seed better than something like Java. So I feel like I talked to a lot of people who took like CS 150 in college, and Java just sort of like, well, that's not for me. That's like, don't judge, all programming by the calculator they wanted you to build in Java in college. But one more thing I would say too is those open source communities are extremely welcoming as well. If like they naturally have a very big community around them. So something like Apache Spark, jump into those communities. They have mailing lists, Slack channels, all those things. Just start somewhere like that. Things that maybe you don't know today, but you're interested in, you feel that could help you in the future. That is a very quick way of sort of, getting into a community as well, because it's already there and they welcome everybody and anybody to them. So
awesome. Well, that's all the questions I had. This was awesome, Josh. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. And this will go up in the next couple of days.
awesome. Thanks, Ken. I really appreciate the time.
No problem. Thank you again for coming in.